All right, this is it. Last lecture, contemporary rhetoric. We've gotten through 2,500 years of the oldest academic discipline in Western civilization. Rhetoric was started 2,500 years ago. It still exists today. So now we're going to talk about contemporary rhetoric. Why is rhetoric back big time? It studies a lot of things, has a lot of emphases. I'm going to give you a nice overview. You can look on the website or around the web and see lots more of what I'm talking about. The people that I'll mention, the issues that I'll mention. So in writing your final paper, you can go any direction you want. I did put up 10 questions that you could use any one of them if you want, or you can make up your own question. Entirely up to you. But if you have any issues, just give me a call. That's what I'm here for. All right. So as we begin talking about contemporary rhetoric, let's talk about where rhetoric started. Remember that in the ancient world, rhetoric was at war with philosophy. There was a tension between the sophists on the one hand and philosophers, primarily Plato and Aristotle. And that set the tone for what rhetoric is. We saw its upside, its downside, its good points, and its bad points. Plato's legacy for rhetoric, meaning what he's left us and what we look at today, is he offered one of the first compelling critiques of rhetoric. He basically said rhetoric had a moral flaw, that rhetoricians knew little about that which they taught or spoke, and that rhetoric could be a tool that could be used for ill and could even corrupt people. Aristotle has a much more positive and enduring effect on rhetoric as we understand it today. Aristotle examined rhetoric and said, like anything else, it's a tool. It can be used for ill. It can be used for good. But the potential of its goodness outweighs any potential for its abuse. And it's the person whose hands you put it in that determines whether or not rhetoric is a good thing and whether it's used for good, not the tool itself. Just like the same argument you would use about owning a gun. A good person owning a gun isn't going to harm anybody. A bad person owning a gun certainly could. Aristotle's legacy goes even greater than that, though, in that in the 20th century, as rhetoric revived as a discipline, and I mentioned Cornell and rhetorical criticism in the previous lecture, most people used Aristotle's study of rhetoric as the basis for doing rhetorical criticism, and almost all important works in the critical analysis of rhetoric was based on a re-examination of Aristotle's variables in persuasion. The Sophists have actually gotten a pretty good rap in the 20th and 21st century from rhetoric, in that a lot of people have forgiven their moral excesses, because a lot of people now believe the Sophists basically had it right, that rhetoric is a tool of practical life. It's designed to persuade, that people need to gain advantages over other people, that self-interest and self-aggrandizement are important goals for people, and rhetoric is a tool to get you there. And a lot of what we study, and a lot of what we learn, and a lot of what we pay people to train us to do is nothing more than what the Sophists have trained us to do. We want to be effective communicators. We want to get our way. We want to win. We want to succeed. That's exactly what the Sophist educational system was all about. So I guess you could say the Sophists are back. Now, there are two philosophers who lived in the 20th century, and one lived actually a little bit into the 21st century, but they're both deceased. And their names are Chaim Perlman and Stephen Toulmin. Chaim Perlman was from Belgium. He was a philosopher, but also a law professor, but he spent most of his life writing major works about rhetoric. As a matter of fact, he has a book called The New Rhetoric. It's a huge, difficult, complex, sophisticated book written in French and translated into English, in which he lays out a whole new modern system of rhetoric for making practical arguments in areas of particularly justice and ethics. The amazing thing about Perlman's book is it's not a rhetoric at all. It's actually a book about dialectic. In fact, if you read it, It's an updating of Aristotle's Topics, which was Aristotle's handbook on dialectic. So Perlman took what's called a jurisprudential model, a model based on law and legal reasoning, updated Aristotle's notions on dialectic, and created something called the New Rhetoric. It's a very worthwhile book to look at if you feel like you could handle something really sophisticated. And I've got a copy of it if you want to borrow it. Stephen Toulmin, another philosopher, wrote a book called, in the 1950s, The Uses of Argument, which became phenomenally popular and successful in the field of rhetoric and in the field of argumentation studies. And what Toulmin did was he laid out, for the first time since Aristotle, a way of mapping arguments that was different from Aristotle's syllogisms and enthymemes, which existed in Aristotle's rhetoric and dialectic. And the Toulmin model of argument was so popular it was put into almost every speech text, argumentation text, many English texts. It became a model of how you establish a claim. If you have your 101 text around still, or any basic texts in speech or argumentation, you'll see the Toulmin model. As a matter of fact, I just this year published my first argumentation textbook, and in the book, sure enough, there is a chapter devoted to explaining the Toulmin model. Okay, I touched briefly in the last episode about the relationship between rhetoric and epistemology, but that idea in the 20th and 21st century has developed big time into a major focus. So to reiterate, epistemology is actually a branch of philosophy that studies knowledge and how it's acquired. There have basically been three major questions in epistemology since it was first created in ancient Greece. The first question is, what are human beings capable of knowing? Secondly, how do they know? In other words, what is the method by which they know? And finally, if they do know anything, how does their knowledge increase or grow? In other words, a legitimate question about what we know is, do we know more now than we did, let's say, 500 years ago as a society, as a culture, as human beings? Most people would say yes. Another big theme feature, matter of fact, this is kind of my area of research, rhetoric of science. The rhetoric of science is that branch of rhetorical studies in contemporary times, which says that if I'm going to look at how persuasion takes place, I'm going to make the focus of that science. So scientific issues, scientific disciplines, scientific communities have their own way of arguing, their own way of making claims, their own way of persuading. They have their own practices that make them rhetorical communities, and there's a lot of good research that makes that argument as well. A lot of that rhetoric of science research is actually anti-scientific because it's basically saying science isn't the distinct or special category of knowledge that we often assume it is. So they attack things like, for example, evolution as basically not a scientific theory as much of as a community of belief. Next, rhetoric and logic. At the beginning of the 20th century, philosophy, which was the discipline who had traditionally studied logic, Aristotle created logic 2,500 years ago, 2,400 years ago. That basically was within the domain of philosophy forever. In the beginning of the 20th century, logic took a turn toward mathematics, and it became what's called symbolic logic. Almost all logic that's studied by philosophers is studied in using what's called a propositional calculus that was developed in the earliest 20th century. So if you take a modern logic course in a university in a philosophy department, you're basically studying symbolic logic. You're not studying arguments or how to make real arguments. The interesting thing about it is it led people like Perlman and Toulmin to say that philosophy was much too analytic or technical, and so that when they saw that rhetoric and logic had diverged, that rhetoric was about arguments for practical matters, logic was about arguments simply for analysis using mathematical models, they said that's not good, and they tried to bring them back together. Rhetoric and truth. So this is an interesting concept in that if you believe, like many modern rhetoricians do, that rhetoric is a path to what you know, it also means that rhetoric is the basis for what we assert to be true or believe to be true. And some people would say there is no truth, there's only rhetoric, and therefore rhetoric and truth are the same thing. Whereas some traditional objectivist philosophers would say that truth is apart from human beings, it's external, it's independent. But rhetoricians basically say that everything people know is within humans themselves. Recently, some have suggested that rhetoric itself might be a branch of philosophy, that it's the branch of philosophy that's written below this point here, that rhetoric is a form of practical reason. And in other words, since philosophy studies reasoning, that rhetoric is that branch of philosophy which studies practical reason. In other words, how to make arguments. Okay, a little bit more specifically on the issue of epistemology, there are some different things that have happened historically that tell you where rhetoric is and where rhetoric isn't with respect to knowledge and the claims of knowledge. So first of all, essentialism. This is the idea that comes from basically Plato, that everything has an essence and we can understand its basic nature. This is the most anti-rhetorical of all the philosophies of knowledge. And of course, Plato was pretty anti-rhetoric. The opposite end, as propounded by the sophists, is the idea of relativism, that there is no truth and truth only exists within people, and my truth is different from your truth. At most, we could have intersubjective truth, that you and I agree on something. Also, there are many different ways of knowing. For example, I can have personal knowledge, which is my knowledge. I can share that knowledge with you. We reach interpersonal agreement, and that's the nature of knowledge. We can enlarge that to a society and call that the sociology of knowledge. We can say that everything that we know is just basically the product of social interaction. Now, one of the problems with this position of the sociology of knowledge is what I call the all or nothing mistake, which is to say that if all knowledge is social and there's no truth, then even statements which assert that everything is knowledge and there's no truth are statements that are simply relativistic, and therefore they're meaningless statements. So we have to have something that actually describes the nature of knowledge. So there must be some statement that's larger than, more convincing, more true, more objective about the nature of knowledge than just saying that knowledge is what people believe or what they share. But this has been an ongoing issue for rhetoricians in the 20th century and the 21st century. Now, there was a branch of philosophy called the philosophy of science, which studies what's the nature of scientific knowledge and how does it grow. And there's a branch of rhetoric studies, as I mentioned, called the rhetoric of science. So what do they two have in common? Well, if you go back to the Renaissance, there was a guy named Francis Bacon. He was the guy that first enumerated the method by which sciences advance their knowledge. And that method is called induction. For those of you who have studied induction and deduction, you probably remember that induction is that branch of reasoning, or that type of reasoning, which makes observations, and based on observations, makes either predictions or has expectations. So for example, if you wake up every day and the sun comes up, you continue to believe that every day, as long as you live, the sun will come up. A pretty good bet, right? Hume, however, a philosopher during the Enlightenment period, who I mentioned before when I was talking about Enlightenment rhetorics, he basically said that, there's no proof of that. Obviously, at some point in the future, people say about 4.5 billion years from now, that the Earth will cease to exist. That it's got a lifespan. Obviously, the day after it ceases to exist, the sun won't come up. So the expectation that something's going to happen, even though it's a pretty good bet for the immediate future, isn't a pretty good bet indefinitely. When positivism came around in the beginning of the 20th century, they began to look at a lot of linguistic entities that had to do with the verification of statements, and so they were right in line with induction. But a couple of philosophers took up this issue and came up with very different conclusions from the positivists. There was one guy that his name was Thomas Kuhn. He was actually a historian of science, but he wrote a very, very influential book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And if you ever go to graduate school, you almost definitely have to read it or something based on it. It's one of the most influential books in the second half of the 20th century in any field, anywhere. Kuhn's position is this, that science and also other academic studies have what are called paradigm shifts. In other words, he's arguing that science doesn't proceed by rationality, but it proceeds by revolution. And his example is that Isaac Newton's paradigm of science, which was basically around since the Enlightenment, lasted all the way up until the 20th century, when Einstein started to question whether or not it could predict everything that was going on, not only in our solar system, but in our universe. And of course, Einstein added into the theory of physics a fourth dimension, which showed the limitations of the previous theories of physics as advanced by Newton. Now, there was a guy named Karl Popper, another philosopher of science, who basically disagrees with Kuhn. He felt that there can be revolutionary changes, but that the changes come through rational means, that people make arguments and test theories, and that's how change happens in science. And then one of Popper's students, a philosopher of mathematics named Imre Lakatos, said that actually both Popper and Kuhn were right. He created a hybrid theory. So this raises the question, is science rational, or does science rest, as Popper said, on piles driven into mud? It's an interesting question. One of the most radical answers came from yet another philosopher named Paul Feyerabend, who basically said that science has no rules, and that in science anything goes, and therefore that science is completely rhetorical. One would say that that could be argued is a victory for rhetoric and rhetoric studies, that rhetoric has managed to advance the position that science and scientific communities are in fact rhetorical, and that rhetoric is actually the master discipline over science and not vice versa. An interesting example of that is, a few years ago, there was a famous trial. It was in Dover, Pennsylvania. The trial was about whether or not intelligent design, which is a rebranded form of creationism, should be taught in high school science classes along with the theory of evolution. And one of the experts that they called in to testify at the trial was actually a rhetoric professor, a rhetorician, who argued that a scientific community is a group of people that rallies around a single compelling idea and advances it as the paradigm of study, following Kuhn's idea. This guy's name was Steve Fuller, and he was a rhetorician, and so a rhetorician became a witness, an expert witness, about the nature of science. Very interesting that that occurred. I mentioned before that rhetorical criticism was born in the beginning of the 20th century. Rhetorical criticism in the second half of the 20th century now is one of the major areas of rhetoric. It started out as what's called neo-Aristotelian, meaning that it basically borrowed every idea and variable from Aristotle and applied that as a critical method for analyzing speeches. But by the middle of the 20th century, a whole bunch of new scholars were beginning to see what they felt was a limitation of Aristotle as a critical method. And so all sorts of new methodologies came up. One of them was called genre criticism, where you basically suggested that certain types of speeches have certain characteristics. For example, there's a speech that's been around since ancient times that's called an apologia, a speech of defense. It's a speech that was used, for example, by Socrates at his trial. It was a speech used by Douglas MacArthur when he was forced to resign his command in Korea. So whenever somebody is in a situation where they're defending themselves, they're using this. And the genre theorists said that because those speeches almost always achieve the same purposes, they therefore have the same constraints that they put upon the speaker or the situation, and those are called generic constraints. So people have to behave in certain ways because they're making arguments in certain ways. A good example of that is what's called the analog criticism, where you compare two speeches that are in the exact same genre. So one person had to do a speech in which he had to step down. Maybe centuries before, another person had to give a speech where he had to step down. Maybe the speeches had many similar features, and maybe, again, they were constrained by that. Probably the biggest single influence on rhetoric, both on the theoretical side and the critical side, in the 20th and 21st century, is the work of a guy named Kenneth Burke, a very interesting fellow who never even got a college degree, but was a brilliant genius who wrote prolifically about rhetoric and many other things. He wrote a book called The Rhetoric of Motives. He wrote a book called The Grammar of Motives. Wrote a rhetoric called The Language and Symbolic Action. Many, many books that have to do with the whole modern reconceptualization of rhetoric. For Burke, he was very unhappy with several things that were handed down to us from the ancients in terms of rhetoric. One, he believed that there is no distinction between any persuasive use of anything and any other persuasive use of anything. So, for example, he would not say a speech is persuasive, but a poem is not. A speech and a poem can be persuasive in the exact same way. And rhetorical criticism and literary criticism are absolutely and completely indistinguishable. Rhetoric is rhetoric. When someone writes a novel, there's an author, and the author has intentions. The author is using the novel in ways that are rhetorical. So he's had a tremendously strong and powerful impact. If you want to read more about him, I have plenty on the website about him and links to things about him. I have a little short book that I put together about him on the website. And if you look around the internet, you'll see there's plenty of things about him as well. Kenneth Burke, somebody certainly worth investigating if you want to get more into the study of rhetoric as you mature as a scholar and a student of communication studies. Formalism is actually an idea that comes to us from a mixture of the generic and analog dimensions of criticism and Burke's approach. Burke is very much into form. He believes, for example, that human actions take a form, that we live our lives in sort of a drama, and he has a method for examining that called dramatism, where you look at the agents or the agency or the actors in a situation as if they're characters in a play. Very interesting. It gets to that whole idea that there's no distinction between the fiction and the nonfiction. We always used to say life imitates art, but he's actually saying art imitates life and life imitates art. There's no distinction one way or the other. Fantasy theme analysis is a rhetorical method developed by a guy named Ernie Borman at the University of Minnesota. Actually is both a theory of small group communication and a theory of rhetorical criticism, where it looks at how people in small group settings start to believe things, spread those beliefs among themselves, and those beliefs chain out into the society and become major themes of movements. Finally, rhetoric and poetic. Aristotle was the father of both rhetorical studies and poetic studies. By poetic studies, meaning the study of literature and laying down parameters for what literature is. In the same way that people followed his rhetorical practices all the way up through the early part of the 20th century, especially in analyzing speeches, they followed his poetic practices all the way through even the Renaissance and modern times. For example, if he said that something was a tragedy, it had certain elements, and you would have to adhere to that in writing a tragedy. But this is also something which, again, has been broken down as a distinction in our time. Now, as a result of all these changes in the study of rhetoric, we have new things that we study in rhetoric. We used to study speeches and arguments. Now we study films, including documentaries, but also feature films and fiction films. For example, you could watch the most innocuous film and say, there's an argument in this film. This film is making an argument. It's got an ideology, a point of view. Also, you could study the rhetoric of nonverbal behavior. How does our nonverbal behavior communicate rhetorical or persuasive messages? Visuals, particularly images, pictures, how do they argue? Music, not only music with words and lyrics like protest songs or movement songs, but just regular music. Certain songs, compositions, if they're, for example, soundtracks of movies, have certain effects that lead us to certain conclusions. Obviously, when the bad guys in the Star Wars movies start marching around and you hear that dun 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 dun, you know that something very nasty is afoot. Movements, you can study whole movements of people, like the 99%, or any social movement as a rhetorical phenomenon. And then symbols, just think about all the things in our society where you can just look at them, and just because of what they appear to you as, they have symbolic import, meaning that they carry over some interpretation to you other than just what they are. Think of the logos around the universities, how they reinforce an image for the university. Or think of things that decorate all the objects that we surround ourselves with. The fact that, on a car and on clothing, we broadcast the name or the logo of the thing that we're wearing all over, basically to make a statement about who we are. This is something, by the way, that really came from Burke more than anything else. Burke says that human beings are distinguished by their use of symbols. They're the only creatures that are just focused in on the symbolic. They're more concerned about the symbolism than something than they are about the actual thing. So, for example, let's say you lived in a society where there was a shortage of food. Therefore, you would devise or develop all your religious practices around praying for food, and therefore whatever symbols in your religious practices were associated with your thinking you would get food would be more significant than the food itself, right? So certain objects or certain rituals would take on what we call a reified aspect, meaning they become godlike or they become real. Things that we believe are associated with other things that we need actually become more real than the things themselves. In our society, we have notions like freedom, which we, again, reify. We create them into a reality rather than an abstraction, and we're willing to die for those things. Okay, so that wraps up contemporary rhetoric. Let me request that if you have any other questions about topics that I haven't covered, that you either post them on our website on the bulletin board or shoot me off an email, which would even be better, and I'll put up another video or audio segment explaining more about, like, for example, if you want to hear more about Burke. Okay, so thanks for listening. That's a wrap.